the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, and Professor Emerita of our own Hutchins Institute is going to tell you a little bit now about Robert L. Harris, for whom this lecture is named.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? As the president of the board of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, it's an honor to introduce the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture and to provide information about Robert L. Harris and the community group that supports this unique course. Robert Harris was a World War II vet who retired and moved with his wife Claire to Sonoma County after a distinguished career in school teaching and administration. For many years, a group in Petaluma coordinated an annual Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Remembrance event that then became an annual Holocaust commemoration, Yom HaShoah. At the Yom HaShoah event held on this campus in 1983, the university president, Peter Diamandopoulos, was the keynote speaker. After the event, he challenged Robert, who was that year's coordinator, to do more than just memorialize the Holocaust at an annual event. That was the beginning of our university-community partnership. We think it was the first one for Sonoma State. SSU is an ideal place for a permanent program about the Holocaust. Professor John Steiner, a Holocaust survivor and professor of sociology, had begun to teach classes dealing with issues related to the Holocaust. Additionally, both Professor Paul Benko, a Holocaust survivor and faculty member in the biology department, and Professor George Jackson, a liberator and a faculty member in the psychology department, were teaching at SSU at the time. During the spring of 1983, many years ago, Robert Harris asked a number of people, including Professor Benko, Virgil Miller, and Sylvia Suker, who we honored a lecture earlier this month, to assist him in responding to the president's challenge. Robert also asked ministers, rabbis, and two former students of Dr. Steiner's, Evelyn Evie Sackler and Eugene Krause, another local survivor, Walter Cutner, and Irv Newman, from the group that had coordinated the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Remembrance. Sylvia Suker remembered Robert Harris as indefatigable leader with an enormous determination. He was able to work with all types of people, an inspiration. As Joe Newberg, who's here with us today, as a past Alliance president recalled, Robert was a one-person organization. He knew what needed to be done, how to interface with individuals and groups, and how to handle all the fundraising. He would simply ask, and people would donate. The Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust was thus formed in 1983 on behalf of the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and the desire to tell their stories and learn from their experiences. Those who began this collaborative effort between the community and members of the Sonoma State University faculty promised to let the world know the atrocities that had occurred. Their initial intention was primarily to learn the facts, act on them, and never forget. As a result of these efforts, a highly successful lecture series on the Holocaust and Genocide, now in its 34th year, was created at Sonoma State University. Initially, it included 5 to 6 lectures a year and grew into this upper division general education course that currently enrolls 100 students annually. Almost from its inception, the series included lectures on other genocides as well as the Holocaust. Professor John Steiner became the first director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust at Sonoma State, and he was succeeded by Professor Emerita Vern Goodman, who had been the first student assistant hired in the center in 1987. As a university community partnership, the Alliance Board includes members of the community, university faculty and administrators, and students who participated in the lecture series. Its current mission is to co-sponsor the lecture series, support SSU's Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide in providing programming to the larger community, including secondary school teachers, and to collaborate with other community groups working with issues related to the Holocaust and Genocide. In 2010, the name of the Alliance was changed to the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide to reflect its continuing education commitment to include all those affected by genocide. And 2 years ago, the Alliance Education Committee expanded to include outreach for local middle and high school principals and teachers, coordinating lectures by Holocaust and genocide survivors and their descendants, and recruiting and training survivors and descendants who had not previously spoken to student groups. After Robert Harris's death, the members of the Alliance decided to name an annual lecture in this series as a tribute to his unswerving dedication and commitment to Holocaust education. We are truly indebted to Robert for his vision and leadership. Would any past and former members of the Board of the Alliance who are here today please stand so we can acknowledge the work that you've been doing. Don't be shy. I know there are a lot of you here. Greeting you as you arrive. We are grateful to them and also to the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, the Peninsula, Marin, and Sonoma counties, who've been generously underwriting this lecture since 2009, and also to Pearl and David Furman, who are here today and have also assisted in underwriting this lecture. Thank you. And we also want to acknowledge Professor Diane Parnas, who serves as the academic coordinator for the series and continues this important work. For those of you interested in its history, there's a binder on the stage, or will be shortly, with flyers from each year of the series. Please feel free to browse through it after today's lecture. The Alliance also co-sponsors an annual community-wide commemoration of the Holocaust, Yom HaShoah, with other organizations in Sonoma County. This year's program will be held on Sunday, April 30th from 2 to 4 p.m. in Santa Rosa. The theme will be speaking for the moral obligation of Holocaust memory. We hope that you'll be able to join us for the community-wide Yom HaShoah commemoration on April 30th. Copies of the flyer for the commemoration will be available on the stage as you leave today. If any college or high school students with us today are interested in serving as escorts for Holocaust survivors at that gathering, please see me today or after next week's lecture. Thank you.
Well, one quickly learns when putting together an introduction for Michael Berenbaum that if you only focus on the most significant highlights of his career, you won't have time for the presentation. So just for a few key highlights. Professor Berenbaum is a rabbi, a professor, an author of 20 books and reams of articles. He is a very distinguished filmmaker whose work has been awarded the Oscar and the Emmy, and he is simply our premier scholars on the Holocaust. Dr. Berenbaum was the project director for the development of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and he served as the first director of its research institute. He was later the president and CEO of Steven Spielberg's Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. Their work collected the testimony of 52,000 Holocaust survivors in 32 languages and 57 countries. Dr. Berenbaum is currently the director and professor of Jewish Studies at the Ziggy Ziering Institute at the American Jewish University. Of late, Professor Berenbaum has focused on consulting on and creating genocide memorials around the world. He deals directly with precisely the dilemma that this lecture series considers. How does one fashion the transition from memory to history? After the last survivor has passed away, how do you ensure that that memory will live? Please welcome Professor Ramada.
Am I mic'd now? And you can hear me? Okay. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here again. I think this is the third or fourth time that I have given this lecture. Is it the fourth or the third? Okay. So I'm always honored to be here. I'm always honored to be here with old and good friends and to see people that I've known over all the years, and it's a pleasure. Let me begin by saying we are at a transitional moment. And the transitional moment is we're at a moment when, in a very interesting and fascinating way, memory is being transformed into history. The average age of survivors who survived were 18 to 40. That means that if they survive, they're now 89 to 111. So the last survivors who are around are what we call children's survivors of the Holocaust. And children's survivors of the Holocaust are coming of age in a very particular way. They're coming of age because for many years the validity of their testimony was denied. The validity of their testimony was denied because they would say, what could you remember? You were only a child. And children understand emotive information far more deeply and far more profoundly than they understand historical context. But they have now assumed in a very interesting and very powerful way, they've now assumed the burden of memory. And with them and with their passing, with their deaths, we will then move into a sense of only historical memory. I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes one piece of testimony, which you're going to see because it's a child survivor who's going to describe being in the pits when they shot, being thrown into the pits by his father when they shot and murdered the people of his town. And you're going to notice a couple of things about his testimony that are very interesting because he sees it from the perspective of a 10-year-old. And seeing it from the perspective of a 10-year-old, there'll be a moment in the midst of this most horrific testimony when you're going to be tempted and permitted to laugh because a child sees things very differently. I'm also noticing up there that we had this year the incredible loss of Elie Wiesel, which means in essence that he was a child survivor of Auschwitz. He entered Auschwitz at 15. He left Auschwitz shortly after his 16th birthday. And again, he died as an old man, meaning in his late 80s, but also that means that we're losing the sense of that generation. Let me also say that part of what we're not losing, and I'm going to talk about the different ways in which we're gaining information, part of what we're not losing today, unfortunately, is we're not losing the relevance of the topic, and we're not losing not only the relevance of the topic, but the interest in the topic, and also in a very dramatic way its implications. I was asked years ago, what would I like to be the perfect ending for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum? And I said the perfect ending for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum would be, we would say that's what 20th century humanity did one to another. We couldn't do that now. We're smarter, we're better, we're more decent. Our world could never go in that way. And in a very deep sense, we're going to see that that's not true of our world. And in fact, in every sort of direction that we move in, the Holocaust has become not less relevant, but more relevant. And we're going to see that as we go through. So in one sense, interest in the topic has not waned. The relevance of the topic has not waned. And also, right now, in a very fascinating way, you have permission to ask questions because we stand at a distance from the event. You have permission to ask questions that you might not have been able to ask before. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Two examples from my own work. About 35 years ago, I was reading a Holocaust memoir and I started laughing. I started laughing uncontrollably. And I said to myself, you know, you're not the worst person in the history of the world, because if you deal with this field, you know who qualifies for the worst person in the history of the world, or one of the worst persons in the history of the world. So how is it that when he's describing awful, evil, and terrible things, you're laughing? And then I noticed that the reason I'm laughing is because the way in which, this is the diary of Chaim Kaplan, the way in which he described the event was through humor. And all of a sudden I said, okay, if I notice that, then I am going to collect. I'm going to collect a series of jokes that were told by people in the Holocaust as a modality of maintaining their sanity and their power, and I'm going to collect them. And I'm going to do what my teacher Abraham Joshua Heschel did, and that is I'm going to say something that you're going to call me a liar in 1 second. Abraham Joshua Heschel never wrote a book. Now all of you are going to say, but wait a minute, go to the library, there are 20 books by Abraham Joshua Heschel, 25 books by, what do you mean he never wrote a book? He wrote a sentence. And then he joined a sentence to a second sentence to a third sentence, and he had a paragraph. He joined a paragraph to another paragraph, and he slowly had a chapter. And when he had a series of chapters, he had a book. So if you want to read Abraham Joshua Heschel, the key to read Abraham Joshua Heschel is to read a sentence. And then you get the incredible key, and he's going to make all of you embarrassed because English was the 7th language in which he wrote. And the way in which he wrote English makes me, a Native American born person who writes books, embarrassed to write. Let me give you one example. He wrote, a prophet, essentially, and this is maybe a political commentary of our time, the task of the prophet is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Sometimes you feel in our politics the task of the politician today is to afflict the afflicted and to comfort the comfortable. But that's a different commentary. But Heschel put stuff together, so I said, I'm going to collect a whole range of jokes and put them together and see what comes up. And I never quite developed the chutzpah to put together what some would have labeled a Holocaust joke book. But I did put together, and this is why I didn't put it together, I did put together something very interesting. I put together a Holocaust cookbook. But let me tell you what I mean by that. It starts with an incredible story. A woman by the name Minna Pachter died on Yom Kippur on the Day of Atonement 1944 in a place called Theresienstadt. And when she died, she handed to somebody who was near her, she said, if you survive, I want you to do one thing. I want you to give this to my daughter, Anna Stern, in Palestine. Gives her a sealed piece of paper, and she says, give it to Anna Stern in Palestine. The woman survives. She comes to Palestine. She doesn't meet an Anna Stern from Prague. 23 years later, in 1967, she's at a party in New York, and she meets a woman by the name of Anna Stern, who was in Palestine in 44 and who was in Prague in 40. And she says, I have a present for you from your mother. If you don't get chills with that, you're not quite normal. And she gives her something, and what she gives her essentially is a cookbook, a compilation of recipes that these women in Theresienstadt had gathered, because what they were trying to do was to essentially preserve the material culture of their world. What is the material culture of a Central European woman with a home and a family? The material culture centers around the kitchen table and the dining room table. It centers around holidays and festivals, and it centers around family and gatherings. So these women dealing in starvation all of a sudden gathered together these recipes to preserve their own what? Material culture. We published the cookbook, and we discovered two things in publishing the cookbook. First thing we discovered is that you need a real kitchen to be able to get a recipe. Something was missing in every recipe. Now, some people say that's because women don't really want to transmit their recipes. But the reality is that, and I remember this from my own mother, my mother would sometimes give the recipes by saying, and when I was a bachelor for the first time living on my own, and my mother was giving me a recipe for my favorite dishes over the phone, and she would go like this, I would say, that's not helpful. How many teaspoons? How many teaspoons? They left something out. The second thing is I developed something. I said, look, if you're going to buy this cookbook, you can't buy it unless you make me two promises. Promise number one is that you'll cook from it, but only for a joyous occasion. These women have suffered enough. And the second is that you will bring them to your table and tell their story. We published the cookbook. I get attacked for publishing a cookbook, but I have a thick skin. And therefore I took it, and everybody said, okay, now there's a Holocaust cookbook. The next thing we're going to have is a Holocaust joke book. And then all of a sudden, out of that came something remarkable. We got 12 different cookbooks that had been created in concentration camps. Meaning that this was one of the ways, and it was no different than the children's drawings that were done in Theresienstadt, then the diaries that were written clandestinely, and then all of the modalities by which people remembered what was important for them in their culture. 20 years go by. A woman comes into my office. She says, I need to interview you. And she does a cross-cultural study of people who create cookbooks in starvation. And we're all of a sudden a major show on French television. She humiliated me because I gave the first interview in France, and she told me to speak English. So even if you learn a foreign language, you got to be careful, because you got to keep up with the foreign language. And lo and behold, this is one of the modalities of remembrance. When you're deprived of something, you remember it. What do I mean by permission? A woman writes a book, and I read the book, and I read it with envy. The title of the book is It Kept Us Alive. Humor in the Holocaust. And what she did was to show the way in which humor was used as a tool for the oppressor to master their oppression. So I'm going to tell you with all forgiveness 4 jokes of the Holocaust, but show you what it means to go and why you're able to use this material. One may sound a little bit relevant today, but that's your imagination. Four men are standing on the street corner in the Warsaw Ghetto, and one says, "Oi." The other one says, "Oi, oi." Third one says, "Oi, weh is mir." Woe is me. Fourth guy says, "Gentlemen, if we're going to talk politics all day, I'm leaving." Okay? Second, a child is asked, and imagine a child, not you. Imagine a young child who's been starving. Imagine a young child who's lost his parents. And imagine a child is asked in the Warsaw Ghetto, what would you like most of all if you were Hitler's son? A Mercedes, a mansion. He says, I'd like to be an orphan. I'd like to be an orphan. What is the child able to do in that way? The child is able, in a very deep way, to use humor to what? To fantasize about taking his own situation and fantasize what happens if you lose the bad guy, not the good guy. And humor becomes the dramatic tool of oppression, by which the oppressed momentarily conquer their oppression. This is also something that you may find a little bit relevant in the era of fake news. Two Jewish men are sitting on, they can't sit on a park bench, they're sitting on a sidewalk. One is reading the Jewish newspaper and the other is reading Der Stürmer, which is the German propaganda rag. Guy reading the Jewish newspaper turns to his friend, he says, "Yankel, how can you read such garbage?" Yankel turns to him and says, "Chaim, how can you read such garbage?" He says, "What do you mean? You read your newspaper and you hear that conditions are terrible, that they're getting worse. The following decrees have been placed in things. The rumors are that next week it's going to be worse than this week. And we are suffering and impoverished and it's going to get absolutely worse." He said, "I read my newspaper and I realize the Jews control the world. That we have all the money in the world, that Roosevelt is actually Rosenfeld, that we're speaking into his ear and we dominate the world. Why would I read your newspaper when I could read my newspaper?" And part of that is, again, the way in which they poke fun at their own situation in a very dramatic way. So humor becomes, and by the way, those of you, how many of you have seen Curb Your Enthusiasm? You know, how many of you are uncomfortable when you laugh at Curb Your Enthusiasm? You know why you're uncomfortable when you laugh at Curb Your Enthusiasm? Because Larry David is the same miserable son of a bitch with $1 billion in the bank that he was when he was a poor, starving comedian. He believes everybody is oppressing him, and therefore he is using the tool of the oppressed to feel himself oppressed even in the conditions of enormous privilege. And therefore when you laugh, you feel a little bit ashamed of your own laughter because what? Because all of a sudden it's the tools of oppression that are being used back by a man of enormous privilege. And you have to understand that, and that also is a unique commentary. We are now in an era where you can approach certain issues. The last, which we're going to deal with now, is what is one of the fundamental questions? Why the Jews? And you know how that question was answered in humor. It's all the fault of the bicycle riders. Now you might ask, why the bicycle riders? Why the Jews? In other words, the way to push at it is to push it to its level of absurdity. Interestingly enough, the new research that has been coming out And we've seen a development of research over the last 20 years. The new research that's coming out indicates that why the Jews becomes one of the most serious of all questions. And a fellow by the name of Timothy Snyder, who just wrote something called Black Earth, begins by saying why the Jews, and he said the Jews were killed and the Jews were targets because Hitler lived in a universe in which it was a universe of total domination. And the universe of total domination was a universe in which the powerful rule, or if they are weakened in their exercise of power, they are destroyed. And these crazy Jews have introduced two concepts into the world that undermine Darwinian survival of the fittest. The first concept is justice, the second concept is compassion. And he couldn't go after justice and compassion as represented in Christianity because it was too powerful. Therefore, in order to triumph with the survival of the fittest, you had to go off and get rid of these people who have introduced these difficult concepts that go against the full exercise of power. And part of the question then becomes, why the Jews? Whole range of reasons, and we've seen scapegoating and victimization, we've seen bullying and a whole range of things, but it may have been something about ultimate values that contradict the type of triumphalism that you have if you have the unmitigated expression of power. I want to show you one piece of testimony, if my guy can put it up, because I want you to see. Let me introduce the testimony in one sense. And how many of you have been to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum? How many of you remember the room called the Tower of Faces? The Tower of Faces represents one town called Ashishki, which is a Jewish village where on the day after Rosh Hashanah, on the day after the Jewish New Year, 3,441, I believe, people on over 2 days were marched out and killed. What we're going to show you here is one person who survived. And I want you to see the testimony that he has, and I want you to also see the struggle that we have in making this film to deal with the question of history and memory. So let's show it, and we'll look at it.
They used to take 4 lines, 20 people, and keep the rest behind. So let's the 20 people undressed. Chasing with the dogs over the beatings of sticks, close to the graves. Don't care if it's children or men or humans. Blah, 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 blah. Killed this 20, the rest meanwhile, yeah, coming to the graves, meanwhile the second line, undressed, was chased, and so on, so on. My brother only kept him, my brother didn't let off my father for a second. Whatever he did this. Only grabbed him by the right leg, he wouldn't let him go. When he slept, to take 4 lines. I never saw his face. He was so hiding his face to his leg. Keep the rest behind. The last did 20 people undressed. We are marching. When chasing the dogs, the same thing. Over the beating. Before we came to the edge, Reb Zushi, my teacher, close to the graves. Say only saying, if it's saying a prayer, saying prayer. I remember the prayer. He pulled me Citroën, I filled this one, the rest meanwhile. I accept this coming to the graves, meanwhile the second line. And I feel better. Was chased. I feel good, makes me feel good, this was. Even I have no brother didn't let off mine. And the machine gun started to play, and the machine gun started to shoot. Whatever he did. He grabbed him by the right leg, he wouldn't let him go. When shooting started. They used to take 4 lines, 20 people, and keep the rest behind, to let the 20 people undressed. Chasing with the dogs, over the beatings of sticks, close to the graves. Don't care if it's children or men or humans. Blah, 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 blah. Killed this 20, the rest meanwhile, came into the graves, meanwhile the second line, undressed, was chased, and so on. My brother, when he kept him, my brother didn't let off my father for a second. Whatever he did this morning. Grabbed him by the right leg, he wouldn't let him go. When he slapped him, I never saw his face. He was so hiding his face to his leg. We are marching, and the fighter tells me the same thing. Before we came to the edge, Reb Zushi, my teacher, Talmud teacher, saying a prayer. I remember the prayer. It says, "Ipol mitzitro elef, uvova miminecha, elecha lo yigash." I accept this word as I feel better. I feel good, makes me feel good, these words. Even I have no hope. And the machine gun start to play, and the machine gun start to shoot. His arm on my neck. When shooting starts, machine guns get off. When I feel like he gave me a push into the grave. When it wrapped me in, I fall in, he fell in on me. I hear him howling. His blood was all on me. Probably he got in chest shot. He was laying on me. And I don't know how many times, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but I'm still unconscious. I know what's going on. I feel I'm not dead. I say to myself, if that is dead, it's not so bad. I'm still alive, But for a longer time, I feel his body on me. And it got heavier and heavier and heavier. I feel I'm choking. I can't make him anymore. I'm totally. But I couldn't take it anymore, it's weight. I tried to slide out. When I slide out in way, other corpses, other dead people, they wouldn't let me. I was out to slide out from him, but I managed somehow. But I feel my whole body full with blood, and it's drying. But I feel I'm not dead, I'm not alive. But I got more strength every minute. Conscious thought, but come back to me. And not to give anybody a sign that somebody is alive. Because I hear every time screaming or yelling or crying, they used to come. When I hear single shots, they used to finish them. I don't know, I hear a lot of comments around me yelling and talking. But they all went away probably. I didn't look around myself, I couldn't look from the grave up. I could see only the skies, couldn't see what's around me. Little by little, pull over to the edge. I lift up myself. And I start to run, not looking back. What happened will happen, let they shoot me while I'm running. I start to go naked, except the cover, the only cover I got is the blood of my father, of my brother, of Reb Sushi. They were surrounding me all. I couldn't sit down. I took care. I'm free.
I'm not going to close, but if you want to understand the difference between history and living memory, you've just seen it. A historian takes from that several things. Anybody want to suggest what they can take from that? Historians are less interested in the emotion. What he's making come alive for you is the experience of being in there. But if you were giving a historical analysis, what would you say? Good.
Numbers, how they were killed.
Okay. Trench. He gave you other pieces of interesting historical information. How was he saved? He was saved, in essence, by his father probably pushing him into the grave before the shooting started, or momentarily before the shooting started. Now, interestingly enough, and I met yesterday with a man by the name of Father Patrick Dubois. Patrick Dubois, whom you may have had here or you may have read about, has done the Holocaust by bullets. And what Dubois has done in recent years is to dig up the mass graves in small towns throughout the Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Russia. And he's finding several things that are of great interest. He's meeting with the last witnesses who are now in their late 80s because this killing occurred in 1941. So if 1941, that means it occurred 76 years ago. So if you're 10 years old now, you're 86. If you're 15 years old, you're 91. And he's discovering several things there. He's discovering, number one, that there are any number of corpses that have no bullet holes. Any number of corpses that have no bullet hole, any number of bodies that have no bullet holes. What does that tell us in one sense? It tells us what he also told us. Remember what he told us, that any number of people were still alive. They shot them one by one by one. They finished them off, he uses the terminology. What was different about him? He was quiet, he didn't cry out. And what? But he was small, but what did he also say happened to him? Well, the most interesting thing, and some of you laughed, is I thought I was dead, but if this is death, it's what? It's not so bad, because what does a 10-year-old child know of death? But what's the other thing he said? He was quiet, and he said he gathered strength and what? And pushed them off because he was sandwiched in. And then he waited and what? And climbed out. And when he climbed out, what is his first thing? And this is intriguing. Tells you a little bit about him, but also a little bit about how people handle the situation. What's the first thing he says about it? And he says it in a descriptive sense, but in a very truthful sense. What is his last words on the testimony? He's covered in blood, we hear that. What else? But what's his last words? He said, I'm alive, but who cares? In other words, what's taken over at that moment is survival itself. One of the other things they discover is a very peculiar thing, which is also historical evidence. It's something that each of us have in our pocket or in our pocketbook. But each of us who have it in our pocket don't think of what it fully represents. What does a key represent? A key represents that when you left your car out in the parking lot, what do you fully expect to happen when your day is over? You expect it to be there. When you come home tonight and you open your door, what do you expect to happen to your home? The answer is nothing. Right? You would feel violated if what? If somebody had entered your home. Keys represent the full expectation of safety in the world. Full expectation of safety and security in the world, so when people died, were murdered with keys in their pocket, what do we see? We see that their expectation was such, and remember, and this is different than Ghettoized Jews. Ghettoized Jews had 2 or 3 years of what? Of life in the ghetto, except in Hungary and in Macedonia, where they had weeks. But the Jews who were killed in the mobile kill units had what? They were killed in the vicinity of their home. They had slept in their own beds the night before. They were killed literally within marching distance from where they had lived their entire life. The Jews in Ashishki were gathered in the synagogue for the High Holy Days. This occurred on the 3rd and 4th of Tishrei, the day after the High Holy Days, when the place that was most familiar to them, which was the synagogue, where they all had been becomes what? The anteroom to their own destruction. And what we see here is we see and you also see something else, which I like about the film when we did it. What did you see at the beginning?
Disappearance, and yet what was there that was...
You saw what I regard as the great metaphor for understanding this area. The metaphor is you saw the absence of presence and the presence of absence. And part of what we did was we took away the people and we showed you what the exact same place with what? With merely the place. Now part of that also tells you what the difference is between memory and history. The only way we can fill in that place is what? Is by going back to those who remember what that place was like. Otherwise, it's the place that you walk by with your baby stroller and you have no idea what you're walking by and what it goes through. Clear? It becomes part of what we see. Now I want to talk about, for a little bit, I want to talk about some of the breakthroughs that we've had in research, which is a little bit of the work of the historians, but it's also a little bit of the work of historians that has benefited from historical memory. Historians for a very long time disliked oral testimony. And if they disliked oral testimony, they trusted oral testimony that was given at the time, and they didn't like oral testimony that was given many years later. And one of the reasons they disliked oral testimony, first of all, lawyers know, and there are probably some lawyers in this room, that what? Witness testimony is also distorting. But one of the reasons they disliked stuff after time is because we learn things we did not know, which we then allow us to put it in context. What makes Mikelis Testimony so terrific is he was a 10-year-old boy at that moment. Right? 70-year-old man becomes a 10-year-old boy because what? He's reliving it in precisely the way he experienced it when he goes, right? He's not describing shooting, he's going back and describing what? The sounds, when he describes his brother not getting out from behind his father's legs. He's what? He's a 10-year-old boy. But historians have to work through this material and understand this material. 20 years ago, there was a debate, and some of you will read it in your classes. There was what we call the Browning-Goldhagen debate. Christopher Browning had written a very brilliant book called Ordinary Men on Police Battalion 101 and the final solution. It was a story about a police battalion that went into Poland, was assigned to kill, and over a period of time, it became effective and efficient killers. One of the things that in the book was most startling is that he came up with evidence that people had a choice. They could step down and not participate in the killing, and nothing happened to them if they didn't participate in the killing. And he hypothesized essentially that there was the journey by which ordinary men became efficient killers, and part of that was because of solidarity. And part of that, in addition, because of solidarity, part of that became they didn't want to be known as cowards. They wanted to say they were tough enough to do it, and they didn't want to let down their comrades. 3-4 years later, along comes a young scholar by the name of Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, who says, wait a minute here. We've gone from not ordinary men, but you're leaving out the most important things. These are ordinary Germans He doesn't use the word Nazis. They're ordinary Germans who have been raised on eliminationist anti-Semitism, meaning the anti-Semitism that says, let's get the Jews out of here, eliminate them from our sphere of influence, and they've come to exterminationist anti-Semitism, which is murder. And you can't separate it out from the anti-Semitism that was endemic in German society. We now move 20 years later, and we're discovering that both of them are only partially right, but singularly wrong. Because what's happened now is that you've had the uncovering of all sorts of evidence that was not fully available before. Example. In Estonia, no Germans killed Jews. Estonians killed their own Jews. In Latvia, 2/3 of the Latvian Jews who were killed not by Germans, but by local Latvians. In Lithuania, 66,000 Jews were killed by Lithuanians who showed their allegiance to the Germans because they had been collaborating with the Soviets. Remember, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia had a very peculiar thing between 1939 and 41. Actually, between 40 and 41, they were occupied by the Soviet Union. And many of the people who participated, collaborated with the Soviet Union, became part of the communist system. And the easiest way to demonstrate your loyalty to the Germans was to kill the Jews. So what we see is that, and they killed the Jews, and the Germans fed their killing the Jews because it saved them their jobs. If somebody else killed the Jews, you didn't have to kill the Jews. And consequently, what you had in a very powerful and a very interesting way was that we now see that Goldhagen could not be right, that it's ordinary Germans who have been raised on eliminationist and exterminationist anti-Semitism, because you've had a whole range of other people who have taken care of killing. How many of you saw the movie Denial? The interesting piece about Denial, and Denial did several things that were fabulous. First of all, I have to tell you this, I know Deborah Lipstadt, who's a very good friend of mine. And what I was always afraid of in Denial was a very interesting thing. You have to know Deborah Lipstadt to know that the ultimate punishment for Denial was that she had to keep quiet for 1.5 years. And if you know, and I've told this to Deborah, she knows it, so I'm not speaking behind her back. There are some people for whom keeping quiet for 1.5 years is the ultimate punishment. I would probably be one of them. And for Deborah, even more than me. And I wondered how the writer would be able to do that. There were 2 moments of key evidence in Denial. One was a mistaken reading of a document by David Irving. And the document was when a telegram was sent which said, "Stop the killing of Jews," according to David Irving. And what the document actually said was, "Stop the killing of these German Jews who have been shipped into this territory." David Irving said, "Here's the evidence the final solution did not take place." And what he left out were 3 or 4 very key words, which is to stop the killing of these Jews. Why did they stop the killing of these Jews? Because there were no others to kill them, and the German army did not like killing German Jews, because they are men, women, and children who speak our language, who are of our culture, and some of them even had the Silver Cross, the Iron Cross, that indicated that they were heroic in World War I. What David Irving left out of that was that's why they introduced gas fans, which is they sent gas fans into Minsk precisely so the army would not have to kill what? Would not have to kill people by shooting them. They could have people put them and herd them into gas fans and kill them that way. And again, part of what you saw in that was you saw how some historians can distort, and B, you saw, if you're a historian, what happens if you come to a conclusion without reading the full documentation. And therefore, we historians always like to read not only the document we want, but the document before it and the document after it, and see things in basic context. What can we learn from living memory? We can learn from living memory, we can learn, first of all, the ethos. We can learn the smallest of small details. We can also learn what it felt like, and sometimes you learn what it felt like not by hearing somebody describe it, but by looking at them as they describe it. Let me give you an example. When I teach interviewing techniques, I show a clip from Claude Lanzmann's monumental film Shoah. A man digs up his mother and his sister. And Lanzmann does something that is incredibly cruel. Anybody else would have asked somebody, how did you feel when you dug up your mother and your sister? Natural question, right? How did it feel? And the guy would have looked at you like, that's the most preposterous and stupid and idiotic question I've ever heard. Because at that moment I was numb, I couldn't feel a goddamn thing. Lanzmann asked a very different question. He said, how did you recognize them? And in the 30 seconds that the man looks at him, you see that he's gone back to what? He's gone back to that moment because nobody's ever asked him the question. And what he says then is, and for 30 seconds he's looking, and then he says he noticed his sister by her coat and his mother by her dress. But by asking a very specific question and a very specific detail, you all of a sudden get a totally different ethos of what is happening. The cheap question is, how did you feel? The more intriguing, the more powerful question is, what did you see, what did you hear, what did you do? And what Mikelis' question does, Mikelis' testimony does, is he shows you precisely what you can learn when you have that type of thing. Now, having spoken about testimony, let me show you a couple of more things that historians have been coming up with. An interesting, there is a book out on the German railroads. And it's called The Holocaust versus the SS versus the Wehrmacht. And what the book does is to follow the following things. The hypothesis, the man is a logistics expert, an Israeli army officer who is a logistics expert. And everybody who works out of their expertise believe that their expertise gives a complete story. And you know that in an army, the people who work in the mess tent will tell you that an army travels by its stomach. People who work in logistics tell you an army travels by supplies. Let's look at the two moments at which the most Jews were killed. Let me give it to you in the most vivid illustration. January 20th, 1942, if you've studied the history of the Holocaust, that's the day of what? Of the Wannsee Conference. 15 men gather, 15 men say, we have a Jewish problem. 15 men coordinate and become complicit in a decision that was made elsewhere, which was to murder all the Jews. At the moment of the Wannsee Conference, 80% of the Jews who were to die in the Holocaust were still alive. Let me say that 80% of the Jews who were to be murdered in the Holocaust were still alive. 18 months later, or even 16 months later, 80% were dead. You want to know what happened at Wannsee? You say that that was the moment when death took what? Took off. And the reason is because that's the moment when they went from mobile killers to stationary victims to to mobile victims in stationary killing centers. That's why the railroads become the major element. What's also true about 1942 in terms of the war? What is Germany fighting in 1942? They're not only fighting us, but we're not fully engaged in the war. We're only engaged in the war in North Africa. What's happening in Russia? Essentially, Germany is stretched to the extreme because it has 1,800 miles of railroad separating its home base from its troops in the field. They expected to conquer the Soviet Union quickly, so they did not give men and materiel, and they didn't give winter clothing. And they brought 600,000 horses, and they expected them to live off the land to get the wheat and be able to eat off the wheat because they needed to feed not only millions of men, but 600,000 horses. And what he shows you is that the railroad was at the extreme at precisely the moment in which Jews were being deported, at the extreme. And then he shows you that there was a fight within the German bureaucracy. What do we use the trains for? Do we use the trains to fight the war? Do we use the trains to what? To kill the Jews. What's the second time when the killing takes place at its extreme? And this is in 1944 in Hungary. You want to know the history of Hungary? The history of Hungary is the following. Invasion is March 19th, 1944, when everybody knows Germany's going to lose the war. April and May, the Jews are ghettoized. May 15th to July 8th, 437,000 Jews, 437,402 Jews are shipped off primarily to Auschwitz. 147 trains, 2.75 trains a day, 2,750 Jews a train. What's happening in 1944 in the war front? Precisely after June 6th. June 6th is D-Day. What is D-Day? D-Day is the greatest armada that ever crossed the sea. Massive number of people who are coming across in France. What does Germany need at that point? Germany needs rail lines to be able to move men and materiel and personnel and armaments to what? To fight the Americans. What's happening at that moment? The most massive part of the killing process in the most rapid way possible. Which gives you a very simple thing, which is that Hitler fought 2 wars and the Americans fought 1. The Germans fought the racial war and the war against the Jews, and the Americans fought World War II. And then they said, in the words of my teacher, my friend Jan Karski, after the war we will deal with the refugee problem. And when Jan Karski spoke to President Roosevelt, he said to President Roosevelt, and Karski was only 25, he said, by then it will be too late. And what the book shows is the clash between, the very important clash between 2 goals of a war. And the ultimate goal of the war became the goal that won was the racial war. And Hitler's last words were, I enjoin you what? To keep up in the war against the Jews. Last point, and then we'll take questions. One of the privileges your generation has, and I'm talking to the younger people in this room, is that no generation has left more testimony behind than this generation. Shoah Foundation took 52,000 testimonies, 32 languages, 57 countries. It amassed about 15 years if you were to spend day and night, 24/7 watching testimony, 15 years, and that's probably only about 60% of the testimony that we have on the Holocaust. And the other part that we have is that the tools of technology will be able to make the survivors accessible to you well beyond their years and probably for as long as there are people who use technology. Conclude with a story about what the Shoah Foundation is doing with something else. When we were concluding the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I told you that we had a favored conclusion. Look how 20th century men behaved, men and women behaved. We didn't work that way, so what we concluded with was let's listen to the only people who were able to transition between that world and this world. And that's the survivors. So if you go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the last word is the words of survivors giving you the whole range of their experience. When we were working on that, Richard Nixon's library people came and they said Richard Nixon wanted to conclude his library with what he thought was his most effective format, which was a perpetual news conference. And what he wanted to do was to have you in the audience who come to the Nixon Library ask a question and be able to respond to it, so he would forever be giving a news conference. Very interesting thing, the technology could not work at that point. It took about 5 minutes to be able to sort through asking the question and getting the answer. And some of you know if you've waited 5 minutes for your answer, it's what? An eternity, and you're not quite interested. They've now developed a new technology where they have now filmed survivors in 360 degrees from every conceivable angle. And they've asked them about 2,500 questions in ordinary language. And the computer can retrieve that, and therefore you can have a conversation with a survivor, with multiple survivors, ask them multiple questions and get an answer based on their experience. And that is going to enable you to listen to testimonies with almost instantaneous feedback, and it's only going to get better in a way that you can learn from those who were there. The sadness is that this technology developed only in 2014, which means that all the survivors who didn't make it to 2014, or those who are older now, will not be able to be filmed. The important thing is that it's there for the future. And therefore, this is a conversation in which you who work in this field with not only the Holocaust, but with other genocides, have to continue to think of how do you engage between historical memory, or between living memory and historical reality. And that's a challenge for all of us who deal in this field. Let's take questions. Thank you very much. Yes? I'm going to repeat the question, so if you don't hear it.
I've been to Lithuania, where my family was killed in Viscus, following the story that was shown there. And my understanding, having gone there as well as to Panerai, is that most of the people who were, all of the people who were killed there, were then buried there, and those who were able to survive had to run someplace. But they weren't
Gee, I didn't realize I had paid you to ask that question, because it's going to enable me to do something else. There'll be a very interesting, I'm going to answer that question, but answer it. When I went to yeshiva, there were two ways of answering a question. You can answer a question this way, or you can answer a question this way, which is the easiest way to scratch your left ear is with your left hand. And if you're going to scratch your left ear with your right hand, you scratch it this way. I'm going to answer your question this way. There's an interesting new tool that has developed, and we have to thank the energy, the lowering of the price for oil for the use of this tool with regard to genocide. And that is that oil companies use geothermal imaging to figure out what's under the earth before they dig. They used to have to dig randomly to see if they could hit a well. Now they use geothermal imagery. But because oil has been so cheap, they're doing a little bit less digging now than they used to. And there are a couple of people who lend to archaeologists geothermal imaging techniques, which cost several millions of dollars to be able to do it. And there'll be an interesting show on PBS week after next on the archaeology of the people who escaped from Ponar, on the escape tunnel, and it will ultimately feature one of the people who was part of their escape, but it's going to be able to find the tunnel. And part of that also, it's able to show you where the bodies have been buried, and therefore you no longer have to dig without knowing what you're going to find. To survive outside and be sheltered, remember, there are two ways of hiding. One way of hiding is to be sequestered, and the other way of hiding is what we call passing. Passing means you pass as a non-Jew. Easier for women than for men because Jewish men were circumcised, and easier for someone who spoke a language fluently without an accent than for somebody who spoke with an accent. And interestingly enough, in religious homes where the boys went to parochial schools and the girls went to regular schools, girls stood a greater chance of survival because they spoke Polish fluently, and the boys spoke Polish haltingly or spoke it with a Yiddish accent. And you couldn't walk around like this if you wanted to pass. Now, passing also depended on something else, which is anybody who's ever known you could identify you. And there were rewards for identifying you. Now, think of it. There are lots of people who know you whom you do not know. The kid who was 3 years ahead of you in high school and the kid who was 3 years behind you in high school. Somebody who's in your dorm that you've never had a word with but may know who you are. Somebody who played with your brother that you didn't know and you haven't seen, and all of that stuff. So you needed, essentially, if you're going to pass, you needed to be able to have a language fluency. You needed also to presume that you could get by. Jews who escaped very often went back into the ghetto because it was the safest place for them to be. Some people who operated on the Aryan side began to understand that they needed other techniques, and there was something very interesting. It was called "Your Eyes Could Betray You." Now, why could your eyes betray you? Because if you were Jewish, you would notice something that somebody else had already passed by and taken for granted. Remember how all of you when you see an accident on the highway, remember how all of you turn around? Even though you know should not be done, but what, you can't take your eye off what? If you saw a certain type of destruction, your eyes would turn and notice it, and you might develop sadness. One woman, Vlad, who was a friend of mine, developed an interesting technique for hiding. She hid in the open. She was a redheaded woman at that point. Was a redheaded woman her entire life until she turned gray. She said that the way she survived was to laugh. But laugh in a certain way. She said, ordinarily people who are feeling oppressed go like this. Said I started laughing. She said I would make an absolute fool of myself and nobody would ever imagine that what? That this woman who's stretched out with her eyes closed, laughing hysterically, is what? Actually hiding and scared out of her mind. So you had to develop that, and then there were a few people who sheltered people. Not enough. And in Poland in particular, the danger of sheltering people was that it was punishable not only by killing you, but by killing your entire family. So anybody who was Polish who saved Jews did it heroically, and they did it essentially at great risk. And we have to take our hats off to them, but they were few. And given the fact that in Poland you had 3.3 million Jews, 3 million of whom were killed, you only have to imagine the number of people who were required for that. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You were mentioning the 3D scanning and asking the questions to the survivors, but is there any way that you feel that technology may be overtaking more traditional ways? Because I remember when, my mom told me about when microfilm became big, they would microfilm all the books and then throw the old periodicals away. Now you have like the technology that seemed great at the time.
Yeah, look, I still believe in books. I read something, and this is a debate in my home every night. I read newspapers. My kids don't understand why anybody would get a newspaper. They have mercy for trees. I like my hands to get a little bit stained from the newspapers. I can't read a serious book on Kindle, but I can read lots of non-serious books on Kindle. There are different, the problem when I create with technology, what I always say is I have a ground rule. If I'm creating a museum and the like, I never want somebody to ooh and ah about the technology. I want them to ooh and ah about what the technology allows them to see. So I'm not an Apple store. At an Apple store, you're supposed to ooh and ah about the technology. In my work, you ooh and ah about what the technology empowers you to do. And the other thing that you have to understand is that technology has also been related to genocide over all the years. Let me give you simple examples. The Armenian genocide was conducted by telegram. And there were a limited number of people who could receive telegrams, who could send or receive telegrams, and they were all involved and engaged in technology. There's the very famous fax that was sent to the UN by Roman Delier, asking for permission to what? To intervene, and the fact that nothing came back. You folks don't understand, and there's the famous telegram of Gerhard Riegner, and the famous telegram of Gerhard Riegner that informed of the final solution ends up being 8 months out of date, and we now can see into any place in the world because the victims themselves can what? Become mobile forms of broadcast, but we still remain indifferent. And you can see what's happening in Syria, but the desire to intervene is not there. So there is a danger in that. There's also a danger in one of the things that I work with when I create museums is the danger years ago. I'll tell you a personal story. Years ago when we were creating a museum, the question was, do we want people to put on headphones? And I said that my kids had a terrible problem. In those days, you guys don't know what it is, but the older people in this room will. They had Sony Walkman. Now, if my kids were listening to a Sony Walkman, I walked up to them and I went like this, they didn't blink. Their entire universe was through the ears they no longer saw. Now, the problem today is that some of you see the world through your 6-inch or 8-inch cell phone. Your eyes don't see, you don't see beyond your cell phone. So you have to always be cautious with what you're creating with technology. And I don't mind being a little bit of a Neanderthal, but I'll tell you one final thing, which is I had a graduate student, and I had a very brilliant graduate student who hands in his dissertation, terrifically interesting dissertation. He writes his final chapter, and he tells me all the areas he didn't research in his final chapter. I call him into my home, and I poured a stiff drink for him. And I said, Gordon, you've just done a fantastic job, and here's the story. You've convinced me by your last chapter of all the things you didn't do. Come back in 5 years when you've done all of them, and I'll give you your Ph.D. And then he understood why I had poured a stiff drink. I then handed him all my notes on his Ph.D., and I said, part of what you have to do, and any of your graduate students know this, Ph.D. is an original contribution to scholarship. Don't tell me what you didn't do, tell me what the hell you did do, and why nobody else has ever done that before, and why you're entitled to a Ph.D. Comes back 7 weeks later, hands in a Ph.D. It is terrific. And then I find something out. I find I'm angry. I said, why am I angry? Again, I have my favorite line, I'm not the worst person in the history of the world. Maybe close, but not the worst. So if I'm angry, something must be happening. And I realized what had happened is that when I was writing my PhD in the old days when we had a typewriter, what I had given him was 1.5 years' work. He had done it in 7 weeks. He didn't have to beg a typist to retype. He didn't have to correct a footnote on page 13 that made him retype from page, from page 50, from 56 backwards to 13. He had done exactly his work, and I was seeing it as the child I had been who was on my hands and knees begging my typist, please, 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 there's another 2 weeks before my PhD has to come in. I got to get it done. I want to get a job. I want to be able to go on with my life. I want to have a child. I want to, do a whole range of things. I don't want to be a boy forever. And the like. So I am both appreciative of the majesty of technology and also want to be a little bit of a Neanderthal. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Okay. It's kind of a hard question to ask. It's sort of long but I've noticed, so you're talking about sort of humanizing this history, living history, or living history,
Living memory.
or living memory, pardon me. And it seems this whole lecture series is sort of taking that on. One thing I've noticed though is we're getting all this history through one perspective, mostly with the Jewish perspective, and yet there's sort of this footnote of other groups of people who haven't been represented. And what I'm curious to know is why aren't they at work?
Okay. I want to suggest, that's a very good question, and I want to suggest two things. Number one, question is we're getting all of this through one perspective, a Jewish perspective, and the like. And why aren't the other groups represented? Let's go back and say, I thought you first were going to ask an even more difficult question, which is we're getting it from the perspective of the victim and not the perspective of the killer. And the reason for that has to do with two things. Number one is that very seldom do the perpetrators want to talk, and their deeds have to speak for them. Now, other victims is a very important, or victims other than Jews. We've done a lot of work over the years with victims other than Jews. And in my work, I wrote a book 30 years ago that, in fact, one of the things in my own scholarship is that I think in my old age I have to redo some of the stuff I did in my young age because the research is advanced. It's called a mosaic of victims. Because I didn't want to speak about Jews and others, I wanted to speak about diversity of victims. So for example, some victim groups we don't have particular access to. The first to be gassed were not Jews, but mentally retarded, I'm using non-PC language, mentally retarded, physically infirm, emotionally distraught, cognitively ill, and handicapped Germans who were an embarrassment to the myth of this master race. They were called useless eaters, and they were called life unworthy of living. We don't have access to them because few of them survived, and those who did survive were not particularly articulate, given the nature of their handicap. We have done a lot of research now on Jehovah's Witnesses, and Jehovah's Witnesses are interesting, and I speak very often before Jehovah's Witnesses audiences, and I want to tell you we always have exactly the same battle. Jehovah's Witnesses are intriguing because they are the only voluntary victims of the Holocaust. If a Jehovah's Witness signed a document and said, I will go out of here and I will cease to proselytize, and I will cease to preach the gospel, they could get out of the concentration camp. And they were such pacifists that they could even serve as barbers to the SS, holding razors to their throat. What's my quarrel with them? And when I teach, I always teach a very intriguing thing, which is I say, Jews were victims, Jehovah's Witnesses were martyrs. They died because of the fact that they remained true to their belief. My fight with Jehovah's Witnesses, which is a loving fight because I've done a considerable amount of work, is I said I would have signed the document. And the reason I would have signed the document is I did not think the Nazis were worthy of my keeping my word. And I believe in a God who would say, don't allow them to be killers, don't tell the truth. And they say, but we would have not kept our word before God. And I said, I believe in a compassionate God who would understand the reason you didn't keep your word. Third victim groups, for example, were gay men. We call them homosexuals because gay presumes an acceptance. Homosexuality at that point did not. Gay men who were German and Austrian have important testimony on that. One of the interesting films is paragraph 175, and there's a good deal of testimony about that, but they were reticent to speak for a very interesting reason. And many of them died before then. Until 1969, paragraph 175 was still the rule of thumb in Germany, and if you admitted that you were a homosexual, you could still be arrested. And consequently, they did not, and since most of them were in their 30s in 1930, they were in their late 60s, early 70s in 1969, before that was erased from German law. Therefore, few of them wrote memoirs and few of them gave oral testimonies at that point. And remember, video technology only came in 1978. Prior to that, it was expensive film. And video technology came in precisely as survivors were reaching the age of maturation. The other victim group were Roma and Sinti. And Roma and Sinti had a peculiar thing, which is that they believe in oral tradition, they don't believe in written tradition. Which is that if you listen to Roma and Sinti song, you listen to Roma and Sinti stories, you hear some of the victimization. You don't hear it in the same way. Jews are compulsive about recording things for history. You have Simon Dubnov on his dying words says, "Schreib und verschreibt," write and record. You have massive amount of memoirs that were taking place, and the two groups that were most dependent, most important for documenting were the two groups that were the perpetrator group and the victim group. Germans compulsively documented and Jews compulsively documented. And consequently, you merely have more records of that than virtually anything else around. But anybody who wants to study this studies the whole range of records, because that's the way in which we understand what happens. You also understand the difference between Poles who did not see their society entirely being destroyed, but who were victims. And in fact, we just did a film on a very unique Polish resistance fighter who volunteered to go to Auschwitz in order to be a witness, and worked with the underground to get word out of what was happening in Auschwitz, and that's Pilecki. And all of that. You also have a brilliant film called The Labyrinth, which is one of the most powerful spiritual films written by, done by the testimony of prisoner number 432 in Auschwitz, who, after he had a stroke, decided that he was going to bear testimony in art and also in verbal. So there is in this film, in this field, an awful lot to do. And the foundation, the Shoah Foundation, also works now with survivors of Rwanda and Bosnia and survivors of Darfur, and also with survivors of Cambodia to document the crime. So Jews, because of their compulsiveness, and I don't mean this pejoratively, I just mean Jews are people who see themselves as a people of the book. Jews, because of their compulsiveness, just with the magnitude of the evidence, overwhelm the field. Other groups, though, have to be done. They have to be heard and they have to be experienced. And the one group we don't have sufficiently enough is the perpetrator group, because a crime is both ways. Yes?
You talked about this being a time of transition between memory and history. It makes me think of a film called The White Ribbon. You know that movie? This movie where the filmmaker is photographing a story set in a small town in Germany in 60-70 years before the war. And his thesis is that somehow the Holocaust was present in nascent culture at that time. So it makes me think, maybe ask the question, right now, what is the transition that we're going through on the side of people who are perpetrating such things? It's not only our transition in terms of our culture and our history, but it's also a transition on the other side.
It's a hell of a good question. I have to think about that. I won't dare to answer that in one breath. Yes, sir.
The first question this afternoon dealt with those who were seeking shelter, and your response in part was that there were those who hid them but not enough. So if we look at our contemporary society, where we have friends, neighbors, families who are being deported from our country, given what you do and what you know, what calculus would you suggest we utilize in terms of addressing this question and sheltering, and what are the risks? How do we do it?
Well, look, the worst, let's begin with a couple of things. I wrote an op-ed piece about 6 months ago called "Ingratitude to Donald Trump." And what I meant by that, and before you rip my head apart, let me explain to you what I meant by that. I taught my students something that would take me about 2 lessons to have them convinced of. The first lesson that I taught them was that some people voted, and I don't believe there's any comparison allowed to Adolf Hitler. And I don't think that Trump is Adolf Hitler, and I'm just talking descriptively now. Some people voted for Adolf Hitler not because he was an anti-Semite, but despite the fact that he was an anti-Semite, because they liked other things that he was going to say and do. Second thing I said in this is that Conservative leadership felt that if they put him in power, they would essentially be able to control him as men of wisdom and experience. They would be able to control him and get their agenda through. And they felt that they would be able to use him effectively to advance their own agenda. Those who did were out within 6 months. The best example is his Vice Chancellor, von Papen, ended up being an ambassador to Turkey, neutral Turkey, which was of little significance all the way through. The third thing is that we are in a moment in which we are blaming immigrants for all of our problems and scapegoating immigrants for all of our problems. Number one, we're not dealing with the fact that we're moving to globalization. And the other thing, and this is my sermon to students, we have moved to a knowledge-based economy. The most important thing you can get out of your education is a belief in your own capacity to learn. Everything else is irrelevant. You have to come out of here with the idea that I can master things that I know nothing about, and I've developed the skills to be able to do that, because you're going to have to reinvent yourself 3 and 4 and 5 times later over in the course of your lifetime. You're going to be working with tools that don't exist, in fields that don't exist, with technology that don't exist, with problems that don't exist. And the idea that we're dealing in a world in which and your competition, by the way, is not each other. Your competition is everybody from throughout the world, because as technology levels the field, there are all sorts of things that can be done elsewhere. And the idea that we think we can do this by turning back is something else. Now, one of the problems of the refugee problem is that a president I supported, Barack Obama, tried not to do anything stupid, but therefore didn't act on Syria. And not to do anything stupid also means that you have consequences that produced the death of at least 250,000 people, maybe 400,000 by now, and refugee problem of 2.5 to 3 million people. So he didn't do anything stupid, but indifference always helps the oppressor, never the oppressed. And we are dealing with that. Secondly, our problem is not immigrants. California could not function without immigrants, could not function without undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants, whichever terminology you want. And we have to face it. And we have to deal with it, and we have to accept it, and we have to grapple with reality. So we see that trying to avoid a problem creates a problem. Trying not to address a problem creates a problem. And we've also seen that the American people, and we're seeing that the American people, in one sense, were embracing a series of solutions that are not going to be realizable. The coal industry is not coming back. You can't, for example, in an era when all of you have the capacity to take digital photographs, you can't bring back Kodak Corporation, which was the forefront of technology. When I was a kid in the last century, we had a Polaroid land camera. And the miracle of a Polaroid land camera was what? You could take a picture and you could see the picture develop, right? You guys would laugh at that. You would think it's the most absurd thing we've ever seen, and Polaroid was at the forefront of technology. So coal is last generation's technology. And by the way, if you live in Los Angeles, the idea that we're going to relax smog rules means that my grandchildren are not going to be able to breathe. So that doesn't do us any good. Let me come back to my sermon. Knowledge-based economy. You have to learn how to learn. And only if you learn how to learn and you have the confidence and the confidence that you can learn something, only then are you going to be able to make it in the 21st century. Let me tell you something I learned from one of my teachers. 1969-70. It's probably before some of your parents were even married at that point. I'm sitting in my professor's office, the guy who's my doctoral professor. He answers the phone and he says, yes. Yes. What's the deadline? Okay. Enough. Hangs up. I said, what was that about? He said, well, they called me from one of the most popular magazines at that day, Psychology Today. They asked me if I would read B.F. Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity. I asked them what the deadline was. And then they asked me, do you know about B.F. Skinner's work? He said, I don't know a goddamn thing about B.F. Skinner's work, but by the time I write the review, I will know enough. That's the confidence you have to have, because that's the world you're inhabiting. But if you ask me about our indifference, if you ask me about extreme vetting, we are letting these people wait for 2 years. By the way, if you think in the 1930s that they didn't keep out Jews because they're afraid that with the Jews would come German spies, I mean, I see that every day in documentation. We're living through deja vu all over again. And indifference helps the killers, never those who are its victims. Any other questions? What we'll do now is we'll do the following. I see 3 hands up. Any more hands? We'll take all 3 questions. I'll give you 1 answer, and then we'll let you get out, because for a speech to be immortal, it doesn't have to be eternal. Yes? Please.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's probably not something you can answer in a sentence or 2, but I was speaking in a library with 3 classrooms at Furman this morning telling my Holocaust story, and I had a question I did not feel capable of answering that really threw me. The student asked me after the talk, which contained a lot of context about the Nazi era and the post-Nazi era, why, if we have all this knowledge today, why are, and all the experience in history, why are there still, why is there still hate, why are there still hate groups?
Okay, good question. We'll come to it. Yes.
Yeah, my question is also maybe too long to answer in a single question, but you spoke of the dangers of indifference and apathy, and speaking that in many ways as a real problem that's occurring within our generation, possibly due to constant exposure. I was wondering, as someone who led construction or led the museum that really speaks to that, speaks to empathy and creates understanding. I was wondering how, as a society, or if you have any recommendations to just the people in this room to fight against apathy.
Okay. Let me answer your question first. Your question, Seb. The first thing about apathy, there are 2 statements out of Jewish tradition that I always abide by, and you have to understand both. Jewish tradition has a statement: if I am not for myself, who will be? But the balancing of that is, if I'm only for myself, what am I? And that is that we live in a generation of enormous selfishness, but if you're only for yourself, what the hell are you? And the other is that we have to keep in mind what may not actually be true. And I sometimes fear that we lie. We have to keep in mind a very basic thing, that one person can make a difference and one person must make a difference. And that person must be the person you look at in the mirror when you comb your hair in the morning. Now, you may not comb your hair because you got short hair, but she combs her hair. The person is you. And it really depends on you. It's not, and the third teaching of Jewish tradition, which I love, is it's not incumbent upon you to complete the task, but that doesn't relieve you of the responsibility for beginning it. Why do we have hatred in the world? Let me just say that I'm going to give you a theory of anti-Semitism on one leg at this point, which is I don't believe that anti-Semitism is on the rise. I believe that we have lost our censorship of the expression of hatred. And therefore, if you're anti-Semitic or you're anti-black, you're anti-gay, you're anti-immigrant, you're anti-whatever have you, you no longer have self-censorship about expressing your hatred. I prefer a time when if you hated, you kept those thoughts to yourself. In today's world, if you hate, you not only find a like-minded community, but you have the megaphone of the internet and social media. And that's a danger to our entire society. Why do we hate? Because we're human. Now, there's a difference, and by the way, some hatred is good. But there's a difference if I hate you because you're a lying, conniving son of a gun who's done X, Y, and Z that is evil. If I hate you because you wear glasses, or because you're Irish, or because you're black, or because you're a woman, or because you're a gay person, or whatever have you. If hatred is personal based on the deeds that somebody does, that's it. But if hatred is a group hatred, then that means you don't have an appreciation for the variety, the diversity, the majesty of the incredible thing that we call this world. And this world is essentially a world of magnificent diversity. And we got to cherish every aspect of it. Thank you very much.